The winter sun of 1837 rose the way it always did over Bellamy County, thin and pale, like a candle guttering in its final hours. It touched the cracked earth, the crooked fences, and the sprawling cotton fields that swallowed half the horizon. But it did not warm the ground, and it did not warm the people working it, least of all Eliza. She was 20, though no one looking at her would call her young. Not with the way her shoulders stayed tense, or the way her eyes moved too quickly, always searching for threats. Childhood had been a rumor she overheard once, something whispered in corners by people who didn't survive long enough to speak of it again. She had been born on the Harrow plantation, stamped with its curse before her first breath. Master Gideon Harrow liked to say that God arranged the world in tidy lines, like rows of cotton, like chains of command, like people knowing their place. In his neat design, Eliza had been sorted into the lowest rung and kept there without apology. She was not taught to read, nor speak freely, nor dream beyond the square of sky she saw between the cracks of the loft where she slept. And yet she endured, not because she had hope. Hope was a luxury, but because surviving was the one disobedience no one had managed to beat out of her. The bell clanged across the yard. Eliza flinched even though she had expected it. The morning work began before the frost thawed, and the masters didn't care that the cold made fingers stiff or limbs numb. The frost didn't matter to them. Neither did she. The other slaves filed out of their shacks, silent as ghosts. Silence was safer. Gideon Harrow's overseers prowled like wolves hungry for excuses to snap. A stumble earned lashes. A pause earned them too. Talking earned worse. Eliza stepped out, pulling her threadbare shawl around her shoulders. The fabric was falling apart, but she held onto it carefully. Care was the only way anything lasted around here. Mary, an older woman with graying braids, touched Eliza's arm lightly as they walked. "You sleep?" Eliza shook her head. "No." Mary sighed, but quietly. "You gotta rest when you can. The body breaks when the mind don't get ease." Eliza glanced at her belly, flat now. Thank God, after months of fear that it wouldn't be. Mary noticed the glance and tightened her lips. The masters kept track of the slave women the way farmers tracked livestock. A strong back, a healthy womb. Those things mattered to them more than names or thoughts or the people those women truly were. Eliza had been forced before. 6 times she had carried the children of men who looked at her as one might look at a mule, valuable only for what it could produce. 6 times she had birthed children she wasn't allowed to keep. Some were sold before they opened their eyes. Some were taken to other houses. Some she never learned the fates of. The memory of each one pressed against her ribs like stones. The 7th was coming. She knew it. The masters took turns staking claims they had no right to make. Each of them arrogant, each believing he deserved whatever he wanted. And Eliza had no power to stop their choices. Not directly, but something inside her had shifted this past year. A flame had sparked, small, fragile, but real. It wasn't hope. It wasn't rage either. It was clarity. She would not let her life keep passing like this. She would not let them take more from her than they already had. And she would not let a 7th child be born into chains. She had no weapons. No allies beyond whispers from the few who dared trust her. But she had her mind, her quiet steps, and the patience of someone who had waited her whole life for even the smallest chance. And chances came to the careful. By noon, the fields were buzzing with the low hum of labor, boots thudding on dirt, overseers barking orders. Eliza worked with steady hands, her thoughts hidden behind a mask of obedience. Gideon Harrow watched from his porch, sipping something golden from a glass. His eyes tracked his slaves with the entitlement of a man certain nothing could ever turn against him. But he didn't watch closely enough. Eliza saw everything. She saw which overseer nodded off in the barn after drinking too much. She saw which guard forgot to lock the supply shed properly. She saw which of the Harrow sons left muddy footprints that led behind the smokehouse. She collected these things the way a crow collects shiny objects. One day they might be useful. When the sun dipped behind the line of pines, the day's labor ended. Bodies dragged back to shacks, shoulders sagging, breath shaky. Eliza sat near the fire pit as Mary stirred a thin pot of stew. The aroma carried nostalgia and sadness. It reminded Eliza of times she was too young to remember clearly. "You all right?" Mary asked again. Eliza nodded, though the truth thudded like a heartbeat under her skin. She wasn't all right. Not since the master's son, Corbin Harrow, had cornered her in the storeroom weeks ago. He'd smelled of tobacco and arrogance. He had chosen her for his newest obsession, and she feared she already carried the evidence inside her. She could not let it happen again. Not a seventh time. Mary's eyes softened. She seemed to understand without being told. When a storm coming, she murmured, "You prepare before the sky breaks open." Eliza swallowed hard. "I'm trying." Mary's voice dropped to barely a breath. "You ain't alone, child. Remember that, even when you feel it." The thought gave a small measure of strength. A thread of comfort Eliza curled around in her mind. Later that night, when the plantation's lamps dimmed and the masters retreated indoors, Eliza lay awake on her pallet in the loft. Moonlight dripped through the slats, cutting shapes across her face. She listened. Every creak of wood, every rustle of wind, every murmur from the yard became part of the rhythm she had memorized. Only when the house fell fully silent did she move. She slipped from her bed, careful not to disturb the women sleeping nearby. She eased down the ladder, her bare feet landing on dirt with no more sound than dust settling. She had a plan, not fully formed, but broad strokes sketched in her mind. Revenge was a dangerous word, one that could get her killed just for thinking it. But she didn't think of it as vengeance. She thought of it as balance. She moved through the shadows, keeping to the edges of buildings where the moon couldn't betray her. She passed the well, the chicken coop, the line of wooden barrels filled with rainwater. Her breath remained slow, steady. The supply shed's latch was loose. She had seen it earlier. One of the overseers, too drunk to care, had left it hanging crooked. Eliza pressed her ear to the wood. Silence. She opened the door. The smell of iron and oil met her nose. Tools lined the shelves, things not meant for her hands. Chains, saws, nails, lantern oil. The masters used these tools to build fences or repair wagons. The overseers used some of the same tools for punishment. Eliza's fingers hovered over a small metal file. She took it. Then she took a coil of thin rope. Nothing suspicious, nothing too heavy to hide beneath her clothing. She slipped out again, closing the shed quietly. Every step she took back to the loft felt like a declaration. Back inside, she hid the items beneath a loose floorboard behind the sleeping area. Her pulse was still steady, her breathing still controlled. She lay back down and stared at the sliver of sky. The first move had been made. Over the next week, Eliza sharpened her plan. Not rushed, not reckless. The masters were arrogant, but arrogance didn't make them stupid. Careless maybe, but not blind. So she became invisible. She kept her eyes down, her steps quiet, her expression blank. The overseers barely glanced at her. Gideon Harrow didn't notice her at all. Corbin still sought her out sometimes with that smug smile of his, but she found ways to slip away before he could corner her again. Every night, she sharpened the file against stone, shaping it into something more dangerous. Every day, she watched and waited. People said the Harrows were invincible, that nothing could touch men with that much land, wealth, and influence. But Eliza knew the truth. She had lived under their roof her whole life. She knew their patterns. She knew their weaknesses. And most of all, she knew their sins. The night she decided her plan was ready, the air held a heavy stillness. Even the cicadas quieted, as though the earth itself were listening. Eliza stood in the shadows at the edge of the yard, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Tomorrow, the seventh master would come. Corbin Harrow had already told the overseers to bring her to the main house before breakfast. She had one night left, one night to change everything. She breathed in, slow. Then she moved, and the darkness moved with her. The night pressed close around Eliza as she moved, thick as wool and twice as heavy. Every sound felt magnified. The crack of a branch in the woods, the shuffle of a distant mule, the low murmur of voices from the servants' quarters. She kept to the outer edges of the yard, her eyes locked on the main house. It loomed like a great, watching creature, windows glowing faintly with warmth that did not extend to the people who served inside it. She had lived her entire life in its shadow. But tonight she would walk into that shadow willingly. Earlier that day, she had noticed something useful, something the Harrows themselves had overlooked. A loose beam beneath the back porch, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through if they were thin, silent, and determined. Eliza was all three. She crept behind the house, the cold biting at her bare feet. Her shawl fluttered around her like a ghostly wing. She crouched by the porch, listening. No voices. No footsteps. The lamps inside glowed soft, signaling that the family had retired for the night. The overseers were gone to their cabins. The yard slept. Eliza lowered herself to the ground and wriggled beneath the beam. Dust coated her arms. Cobwebs brushed her cheeks. The wooden slats above her creaked faintly as she pulled herself through. She emerged beneath the porch, where the air smelled of earth and mold and old secrets. She waited until her breathing steadied. Then she crawled toward the opening that led into the narrow crawlspace of the house. She had never been inside the main house except when summoned, and those summons had always ended with sorrow. But she had observed it all her life. Who came and went, which windows opened, which doors stuck, which floorboards groaned under the weight of a master's boots. She reached the low wooden door that opened into the pantry. She pressed her ear against it. Silence. Slowly, carefully, she lifted the latch. The door opened without sound. She slipped into the pantry and closed it behind her. The darkness inside was complete, but Eliza knew the layout well enough. Shelves lined the walls, heavy with jars, spices, and smoked meats. The air smelled of pepper and vinegar. She moved with the patience of someone who knew every mistake might cost weeks, if not her life. She wasn't here to strike yet. Not tonight. Vengeance required timing, and she intended her actions to be more than punishment. They would be justice. They would be warning. Eliza crept toward the adjoining hall. The house moaned as the winter wind brushed against its walls. Lantern light flickered from a distant room, casting long shadows on the hardwood floor. Voices drifted through the hallway, male voices. She froze. "You heard Gideon," one man muttered. "Boy's obsessed with that one. Says he'll take her tomorrow. Fool, doesn't understand the trouble he's stirring." Another scoffed. "He's 20. They think at that age they can take whatever they want." A pause. "Apple didn't fall far from the tree, if you ask me." Eliza recognized the voices, two of the older Harrow cousins who lived on the property. They were cruel in quieter ways, but cruel all the same. They stepped into view, walking down the hallway in their nightrobes. She ducked behind a cabinet and held her breath until they disappeared up the staircase. Only then did she move again. She made her way toward Gideon Harrow's study. She had never entered it before, but had often glimpsed it when summoned to clean the hallway outside. She knew where the door was, knew that Gideon kept the key hidden in a vase near the umbrella stand. She found the key by feel. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the cold thrill of stepping onto forbidden ground. She unlocked the study door. The room smelled of smoke, leather, and old ink. Books lined the shelves, more books than anyone could read in a lifetime. Papers lay scattered across the heavy oak desk. A half-finished bottle of whiskey sat beside an empty glass. Eliza's gaze fell on the cabinet against the far wall. That was what she had come for. Gideon Harrow trusted locks and steel more than people. But steel could be fooled. She knelt before the cabinet and drew the small file she had shaped over the week from her shawl. She inserted it into the keyhole and worked it gently. She had practiced on old padlocks behind the barn. Her hands remembered the motions. The lock clicked open. Inside were documents, deeds, letters, ledgers detailing profits and expenses, and names. Names of every enslaved person traded, bought, sold, or mortgaged over the last 15 years. Eliza scanned the list until she found her own. Next to it was a column of numbers. Next to that, the handwritten note, "Breed strong, compliant, valuable." A chill crawled over her skin. She kept reading. Then she found something worse. A separate list. A private one. Names of her children. Dates of their births. Notes of where they were sent. Who bought them? Prices paid. Prices. She felt the ground tilt beneath her. Her breath shuddered. But she didn't cry. Not here. Not in this house. Not now. Instead, she folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her shawl. Proof. Proof of their crimes. Proof of their lies. A different kind of weapon. She closed the cabinet, relocked it, returned the key to the vase exactly as she found it, and slipped back into the hall. She didn't notice the loose floorboard until it groaned beneath her. A lamp flared to life at the end of the hall. "Eliza?" She froze. Corbin Harrow stood in the glow of the lamp, his hair tousled, his shirt half-buttoned. He had the look of someone who rose from bed in a hurry, perhaps from a nightmare or perhaps because he had sensed something amiss. "What are you doing in the house?" he asked, voice sharp. Eliza lowered her eyes, but said nothing. Corbin stepped closer. "You know you're not supposed to be roaming around here at night." Still she said nothing. He frowned. "Were you running from something? From someone?" She shook her head. He took another step, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You're lying," he murmured. "I can see it on you." His hand reached toward her. Eliza moved without thinking. She stepped back into the darkness. Then she slipped behind a corner with the speed of a hunted creature. Corbin cursed and lunged after her. But she knew the house better than he knew she did. She ducked beneath the staircase, slid through the narrow corridor toward the pantry, and dropped to her stomach. She wriggled into the crawl space under the house just as Corbin's shadow swept through the hallway. "Eliza," he shouted. "You come out now." She kept crawling. He stomped through the pantry, opened cabinets, slammed doors. But he never thought to look beneath the porch. Eliza slipped out into the cold air and ran. Not fast, not foolishly, but swiftly into the dark where Corbin wouldn't follow. By the time she reached the slave quarters again, her breath steamed in the night air and her heart pounded like a drum. Mary stirred as Eliza climbed into the loft. "You all right, child?" she whispered. Eliza closed her eyes. "No," she said quietly, "but I will be." The next morning, the plantation buzzed with tension. Word spread fast. Corbin was furious. He claimed someone had broken into the study. Gideon Harrow was livid. Overseers tore through cabins searching for stolen items. But they found nothing. Because the truth lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard where only Eliza knew to look. At noon, she was summoned to the main house. Corbin stood on the porch, arms crossed, jaw tight. His father beside him looked like a thundercloud given human shape. "Eliza," Gideon said, "we had a disturbance last night. You didn't see or hear anything unusual, did you?" Her face remained blank. "No, sir." Corbin studied her with narrowed eyes. Gideon turned to his son. "Bring her inside." Eliza walked forward, but she did not walk in fear. She walked with purpose. Today would be the beginning. They thought she was coming to obey. They didn't know she was coming to end them. Eliza entered the house with steady steps, the kind that did not betray the storm building under her skin. The foyer smelled of polished wood and pipe smoke. Gideon Harrow walked ahead of her, each boot step clipped and impatient, while Corbin trailed behind, eyes fixed on her like a hawk gauging the twitch of a mouse. She did not twitch. The main parlor waited like a courtroom. Heavy drapes muted the sunlight, casting the room into a gloom that seemed to cling to the walls. Portraits of Harrow ancestors glared down, hard men and unsmiling women, all captured in oil, all painted with the same cold eyes. Gideon motioned for Eliza to stand in the center of the room. He shut the door, turned the key, and slipped it into his pocket. Corbin remained by the fireplace, arms folded. Gideon circled her. "You were seen in the hallway last night." She stayed silent. "Corbin saw you," he continued, "near the study." Still she said nothing. Gideon stopped in front of her. "What were you doing in my house at that hour?" Her voice, when it came, was soft. "Going back to my cabin, sir." "You weren't summoned." "No, sir." "You had no business near the study." "No, sir." Corbin stepped forward. "She's lying." Gideon raised a hand to silence him. His eyes stayed fixed on Eliza's face, searching, probing. But Eliza had learned long ago to keep her expression as calm as still water. Gideon finally sighed. "The matter will be investigated. But hear me clearly, girl. If anything was taken, and I find out you had a hand in it, there will be consequences. Heavy ones." Her jaw tightened a fraction. "I understand, sir." He seemed satisfied enough. "Go on then. Back to your chores." Eliza turned and walked out with the same steady pace she'd entered with. But as soon as she stepped outside, she saw Jeremiah waiting. Jeremiah was older than she, broad-shouldered from years in the fields, with eyes that held too much knowing. He had grown up on the plantation same as she had. Theirs was a familiarity shaped by necessity, by whispered warnings exchanged in the dark, by moments of shared fear. He fell into step beside her as they crossed the yard. "You all right?" he murmured. "No." He nodded once. "They think you took something." "I did." She glanced over her shoulder to make sure no overseer lingered nearby. "But not what they expect." Jeremiah's brow creased. Eliza, whatever you're doing. I ain't backing down, she said softly. Not this time. He inhaled deeply, a sound halfway between fear and resignation. You planning something? She stopped walking. Yes. Jeremiah stared at her. Then he nodded again, slower this time. Then I'll stand where you need me. Eliza swallowed hard. I ain't asking you to get in trouble for me. Some trouble needs getting into. He gave a faint, weary smile. Just tell me when. She didn't smile back. Couldn't. But she touched his hand lightly before continuing toward the cabins, a gesture small enough not to invite the overseer's wrath, yet full enough to carry meaning. When she reached her own cabin, she climbed into the loft to retrieve the paper she had hidden beneath the beam. She unfolded it again. The names of her children stared up at her. Her children. Sold like calves. Priced like hogs. Her breath trembled, but it did not break. Not anymore. She folded the paper carefully and hid it beneath her mattress. Then she sat on the floor and waited for night to fall. Night would bring the next step. When the sky darkened and the plantation grew still, Eliza left her cabin again. This time she walked south toward the old smokehouse. It had fallen out of use years ago and now stood as a leaning wooden ruin near the tree line, forgotten by everyone except the small creatures who nested in its rafters. Forgotten meant safe. Jeremiah was already there, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. You sure you want to do this now? He asked. Eliza nodded. Before they tightened things. Inside the smokehouse, she lit a stub of candle and pulled out the folded papers once more. She laid them on an overturned barrel. Jeremiah stepped closer, scanning the lists, the numbers, the names. His face hardened. God, she whispered, this is what they keep hidden. He touched the page where her children's names were written. You plan to expose them? I plan to destroy them. Jeremiah looked up sharply. Eliza, you don't have to walk with me all the way. I ain't expecting it from you. He shook his head. It ain't about expectation. It's about right and wrong. And this is wrong piled on wrong. Eliza let out a slow breath. I ain't got many people left. I can't lose you too. He almost laughed, but the sound came out bitter. You think you're the only one with something to lose. For a moment, they simply stood together in the dim, smoky air. Then Eliza reached into her shawl and pulled out the second thing she had stolen. Gideon Harrow's silver seal stamp. Jeremiah's eyes widened. Eliza, I ain't keeping it, she whispered. I just needed the imprint. She pressed the stamp into a small lump of beeswax she'd taken from Mary's candles. The wax captured the Harrow crest perfectly. Jeremiah frowned. What you planning to do with that? She didn't answer, because the answer was still forming in her mind. Revenge wasn't a single act. It was a chain of them, each link carefully forged. Instead, she blew out the candle and tucked the wax imprint into her pocket. Tomorrow, she said. Everything begins tomorrow. Jeremiah nodded. Then I'll be ready. The next day brought rain, cold, needling rain that forced most field work to halt. Workers huddled beneath awnings or inside cabins, rubbing their hands together to keep warm. Overseers complained and cursed the sky. Eliza saw opportunity. Rain softened the ground. Soft ground took footprints. Footprints could be placed, and then misread. She took a break from cleaning the kitchen to slip into the rear shed where tools were kept. She found what she needed, a pair of Gideon's old riding boots discarded last season after the sole cracked. Still usable, still recognizable. She carried them under her apron and returned to the yard. In the softened mud near the smokehouse, she pressed the boots into the ground, creating a clear trail leading toward the tree line. Jeremiah, working nearby, caught her eye and nodded. Next, Eliza retrieved a scrap of Gideon's stationery stolen weeks earlier during laundry duty. She pressed the wax seal she'd created against it, imprinting the Harrow crest onto the paper. The seal wasn't perfect, but it was close enough that no overseer would question it. She tucked the paper beneath a loose board in the woodpile where it would be discovered. Her trap was set. By sunset, an overseer found the forged note. It claimed that Gideon had planned a secret meeting at the edge of the woods. The overseer brought it directly to Gideon. Within minutes, shouts filled the yard. Gideon stormed out of the house, Corbin on his heels. Who's been snooping through my affairs? Gideon roared. The overseers pointed toward the footprints leading into the trees. Gideon examined them, face twisting with anger. Someone's been forging my seal. Someone's plotting. He turned to the enslaved workers gathered nearby. Every cabin gets searched tonight. Jeremiah leaned close to Eliza. You ready? No, she whispered. But I ain't stopping. Night fell heavy and tense. Overseers ransacked cabins, throwing belongings into the mud. Voices rose. Children cried. Men clenched their fists in silent fury. When they reached Eliza's cabin, she stood outside, hands folded, expression calm. They overturned mattresses, opened cupboards, dug through straw, but they did not find the papers. Because Eliza had moved them hours earlier. Corbin himself searched the loft, cursing under his breath. She's hiding something, he spat. Gideon entered the cabin then, soaked from the rain, temper stretched thin. Tell me, girl, he said, why is it every time trouble stirs on this property, your name eventually finds its way into it? Eliza lifted her chin. Don't know, sir. You know more than you let on. Maybe, sir. His eyes flashed. Watch your tongue. She bowed her head slightly. Yes, sir. He stared at her a long moment. Then he stepped out into the rain. Corbin followed, muttering curses. Jeremiah approached once they were gone. They're rattled. They'll be more than rattled soon, Eliza said softly. What comes next? She looked toward the main house, where lantern light flickered behind the windows, where 6 arrogant men slept with full bellies and easy conscience. Next, she said, I start taking everything they still value. Jeremiah exhaled slow. Then tomorrow, she said, we take their power. The moon hung low, bruised purple behind a veil of winter clouds, as if the sky itself was keeping watch over the Harrow plantation that night. The earth held its breath. Even the wind seemed unwilling to move, wary of disturbing whatever justice was finally stirring after years of silence. Eliza stepped out from the tree line with the lantern's dim glow tucked against her chest. She carried no weapon but the one she had spent years forging in her mind, her memory. Every cruelty these men had carved into her life lived inside her like hot iron. And now, tonight, she would return each wound with deliberate hands. The barn loomed ahead, dark, quiet, the same place she had been dragged into countless times. Her breath trembled at the threshold. But trembling was not the same as fear. Not anymore. She slipped inside, letting the darkness swallow her. The air was thick with the familiar smell of hay, iron tools, and the sweat of the beasts kept within. A stable horse snorted softly at her presence, stamping its hoof in the straw. She whispered to it, a gentle sound she hardly recognized as her own. The lantern's glow revealed the figure of Amos Harrow, Master Gideon's cousin, slumped unconscious against a support beam. His wrists were bound with his own bridle straps, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. The same man who had once laughed while pinning her to the dirt now twitched as though trapped inside a nightmare. Eliza approached him, the boards creaking under her steps. She knelt in front of him, studying the face that had tormented her for years. When he stirred, his lashes fluttering, she waited. Patience had been carved into her bones. Wahoo's there? His voice was thick with confusion. Where am I? He tried to lift his arms, but the restraints held. Panic rippled through him. Who's done this? He barked. Show yourself. Eliza raised the lantern. The light painted her face gold. His eyes widened. You? She didn't speak. Her silence unnerved him more than any threat. Eliza, listen, girl, untie me. You're in a heap of trouble if you don't. She continued to stare. You don't know what you're doing, he snapped, his fear beginning to rise. Gideon will skin you alive. She stepped closer, close enough for him to see the calm in her eyes. No one is coming, she whispered. Her voice was steady. She had waited her entire life to hear herself sound like that. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the barn door slammed open before he could. Both heads turned. Mrs. Harrow stood in the doorway. Eliza's heart paused. The woman's breath puffed visibly in the cold air the moment she stepped inside. Her nightdress brushed the straw. Her eyes moved slowly across the barn, taking everything in, calculating. Eliza, she said quietly. She sounded neither surprised nor angry. Amos let out a strangled sound. Aunt, thank heaven. Get this wicked girl off me. She's lost her mind. Mrs. Harrow's gaze cut to him. He fell silent. She stepped deeper into the barn, closing the door behind her. The lantern light touched her face, revealing an expression Eliza couldn't decipher. For years, the mistress said softly, I wondered how long it would take. Eliza stared, confused. Mrs. Harrow's voice remained calm as she approached. You didn't think I knew? About what they've done to you? To the others? To the women who came before? Eliza's grip tightened around the lantern. But you did nothing, she whispered. The mistress closed her eyes. I was raised to believe that obedience was survival. That silence kept the peace. I told myself it was not my place to interfere. She opened her eyes again. But I was wrong. And you are right to be here tonight. Amos choked on the air. Aunt, how can you? Mrs. Harrow didn't look at him. Instead, she looked at Eliza with something that resembled remorse, the bare, fragile kind. You deserve your justice, she said. Eliza's throat tightened. She hadn't expected help. Certainly not from this woman. Mrs. Harrow stepped aside, revealing something heavy in her hand, a ring of keys. They belong to the overseer, she said. Every lock on this property is under his charge. She held the keys out to Eliza, including the gun shed. The weight of the keys trembled in the lantern light. Eliza didn't reach for them. Not yet. Why now? She asked. Because I have spent too many years watching monsters walk freely in my home, Mrs. Harrow whispered. And I am tired of being a coward. Amos shook his head violently. You're mad, both of you. You'll hang for this. Mrs. Harrow met his gaze at last. Perhaps, she said softly. But tonight, I answer for my sins. And you will answer for yours. Eliza didn't know what mercy looked like, but she knew this wasn't it. This was complicity breaking under its own weight. She stepped forward and took the keys. Mrs. Harrow's fingers lingered for a moment, trembling. Then she stepped back. You'll have only a short window before the men wake, she warned. Do what you must. Eliza nodded. She lifted the lantern and walked out of the barn without looking back at Amos. His frantic screaming faded behind her. The night felt different now, charged, stretched tight like a snare drum. As she crossed the yard, the keys jingled softly. They sounded like a promise. She reached the overseer's shed. The lock clicked open. Inside were tools, ropes, hunting rifles, powder, cartridges. She stared at them for a long moment. Then she did not take a rifle. She took the rope, and the powder, and a single lantern. Her vengeance would not be a bullet. Bullets were quick, too kind. She crossed the yard toward the Harrow house, the place where 6 men had shaped her torment. The 7th, young Gideon, would soon attempt to claim her as though she were a mare bred for his amusement. A cold steadiness filled her. She would not run. She would not beg. Tonight, she would unmake the Harrow legacy. She approached the house and slipped inside through the kitchen door. The halls were quiet, the floors cold beneath her feet. She knew where each man slept. One room at a time, she moved through the house like a shadow. She began with Gideon. He lay snoring, sprawled across his bed, one hand dangling to the floor. Moonlight painted him silver blue. Eliza set the lantern on the table beside him. She sprinkled powder in a slow circle around the room, careful and precise. When she finished, she touched the lantern's flame to the powder. A soft hiss filled the air. She left the room and closed the door. She did not look back. The second cousin, the third, the fourth, the fifth, each sleeping man was given the same ring of powder, the same quiet fate. Eliza moved like someone walking through the last page of a story already written. When she reached Amos's room, his true room, not the barn where he lay tied, she paused. She opened the door. Empty. Mrs. Harrow had known this would happen. She had sent Eliza to each room with purpose. Amos would face a different reckoning. Eliza lit the powder circle and closed the door. The final room belonged to Master Harrow himself, the patriarch, the architect of every cruelty carried out by his sons and nephews. Her hand trembled on his door, not from fear, from the weight of history. She stepped inside. The old man slept with his mouth slightly open, his breath ragged. His cane rested beside the bed. Eliza walked to his side. For a moment, she simply listened to his breathing. Then she placed the lantern on the floor. She did not sprinkle powder. She leaned close and whispered, I survived you. His eyes snapped open. Before he could shout, she lifted the cane and struck him across the temple with all the strength she had collected over 20 years. He slumped back onto the pillow. Not dead, but broken. She left him there. When she reached the yard again, the powder trails ignited all at once. Blue-white flames raced up the walls like living serpents. Windows flashed. The quiet night erupted with shouts and chaos. The house that had devoured so many lives now devoured itself. Eliza walked toward the fields without looking back. Behind her, the harrow name burned. And for the first time in her life, the wind smelled like freedom.